Thank you. We're joined by Rhode Island Public Radio political analyst Scott McKay. Hello, Scott.
Good morning, Rhode Island.
And University of Rhode Island political science professor Maureen Moakley. Good morning, Maureen.
Good morning, everyone.
We're pleased to welcome as our special guest the independent candidate in the 1st Congressional District, Providence lawyer David Vogel. Thank you for joining us, David.
Good morning.
David, you're a new face on Rhode Island's political scene. Tell us, who are you and why are you running for Congress?
I'm not quite a native Rhode Islander, but I did grow up here and moved here in 1971. I was 4 years old. And growing up here, I've gotten a chance to observe Providence and Rhode Island as it's kind of come out of the dark ages, if you will. And what has been striking to me is on the political scene, I grew up in something of a political family. We have mounting evidence that suggests that our politics as we know it, which we all grew up learning is of the people, by the people, for the people, has become anything but. And at this point, well, I'm not much of a protester, but I felt that getting involved kind of was almost a necessity at this point in my life.
And what are the top issues for you in this campaign? How are you different from David Cicilline and Brendan Doherty?
Okay, well, I'm certainly different from Mr. Doherty. Very, very different. I grew up as a Democrat, full disclosure, so I certainly do not share the right-wing agenda. In terms of Mr. Cicilline, what's interesting is that both he and I are somewhat progressive in many ways, but I think we differ on some fundamental philosophical issues, mostly with respect to tax policy and how you can really kind of start to generate jobs for the economy. I mean, I'm not a person who's going to say it's all about jobs, but certainly you'd be crazy to think that that's not a very high issue.
Let's go to Maureen.
Well, how specifically do you intend to reform the tax policy so that we're going to get more jobs?
Okay. The Democrats actually did propose a full reform package earlier this year. I don't believe that's come up for a vote. In fact, I'm not even sure that the specifics have been hammered out. However, I practiced tax law for almost 3 years at the beginning of my legal career. And one of the things I noticed is that the tax code is very incentive-laden for actually doing what companies have been doing, which is moving jobs offshore. I know a lot of people, particularly Mr. Whitehouse and even Mr. Cicilline to some extent, have talked about closing the loopholes, but I think it goes further than that. I think that there is a combination of carrot and stick that you can actually put in the tax code that would bring those jobs back. And if you'd like specifics, we can go into that, but it would take a little while.
But are you willing to do that on the campaign trail when it's really hard to explain beyond a soundbite these kinds of issues?
Well, it is hard to explain it beyond a soundbite, but it is not hard to explain it in the sense that you can say to people, look, the tax code is incentivizing the activity of corporations to offshore jobs, and it can be reverse engineered to do the opposite.
Let's go to Scott.
You know, you're not a Republican or a Democrat, but we want to ask you, who are you voting for president?
Mr. Obama.
Why?
There is not a viable independent candidate out there.
And David, jobs in the economy are obviously a top issue for most Rhode Islanders. What are your thoughts on what Rhode Island needs to do differently to have a better economy?
Sure. There's a couple of answers to that. The first thing actually comes from the RIPEC report, which I think we're going to talk about later. Rhode Island does need a bedrock of being able to be business friendly. There's no question about it. But beyond that, my counterpart over in District 2, Abel Collins, has actually talked about green energy for quite a long time. And Rhode Island itself is very well positioned with water resources and wind resources to be a part of what I think is a grid of the future. And so I don't see it as inconsistent to be able to start to develop some of that in an economic sense and bring jobs here.
I'd like to ask you about this race.
Sure.
Assume you get 15,000 votes and David Cicilline loses. You're the spoiler. What do you say to that?
Tough. Look, I'm in the race. I'm constitutionally allowed to be in the race. The other people have to earn their votes just like I do. Oh well.
David, as you said, the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council came out with recommendations for its thoughts on overhauling economic development in Rhode Island. Among other things, RIPEC calls for a new gubernatorial appointee to oversee business development. Scott, let's get your thoughts on whether anything is really going to change as a result of this report from RIPEC.
Well, you know, if this state was a shelf, it would be groaning under the weight of the various economic reports that have been dropped over the years, going way back to the 1980s with the Greenhouse Compact. And if you reread the Greenhouse Compact, a lot of the things that were talked about there, people are still talking about. How to integrate our university and research facilities into the economy. How to push our assets, such as aquaculture, fishing, geriatrics, medical care. So you just wonder, Is this thing going to be ignored or not? The other thing that really I think we have to think about very seriously is this whole idea of putting an economic czar on top of DEM, our Department of Environmental Management. Is that really smart? Do we, as desperate as we are for jobs, do we really want to trade off the environment versus the economy? Look, this state does a huge tourism business. And don't forget, we've tried desperate things in the past. Go back to the 1950s and remember that big proposal that was pushed even by Governor Roberts, who kept seeing textile mills moving every week to the south. They were going to put a huge oil refinery on the north end of Jamestown. How many sailors do you think would want to come up to our bay if this commerce oil thing was just belching all kinds of pollution?
Maureen, it seems like the General Assembly might be reluctant to sign off on elements of the RIPEC report. The economic czar proposed by RIPEC would not require Senate confirmation. What are your thoughts on what anything will really change here?
I think eventually